Chapter 16 of Bertram Cope's Year. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Bertram Cope's Year by Henry Blake Fuller. Chapter 16. Cope Goes A-Sailing. Cope was himself in a few days. He set aside his aunt's counsel in regard to a better regimen, as well as her more specific hints, made in view of the near approach of rough weather, that he provide himself with rubbers and an umbrella, even if he would not hear of a raincoat. "Am I made of money?" he asked. He gave a like treatment to some intimations contributed by Medora Phillips during her call. He met them with the smiling, polite, half-weary patience which a man sometimes employs to inform a woman that he doesn't quite know what she is talking about. He presently in as active circulation, on the campus and elsewhere, as ever. The few who looked after him at all came to view that he possessed more mettle than stamina. He had no special fondness for athletics. He was doing little to keep, still less to increase, a young man's natural endowment of strength and vigor. Occasional tennis on the faculty courts, and not much else. So the vast gymnasium went for little with him, and the wide football field for less, and the great lake close by for nothing. This last, however, counted for little more with any one else. Those who knew the lake best were best content to leave it alone. As a source of pleasure, it had too many perils. Treacherous was the common word. Its treachery was reserved, of course, for the smiling period of summer. Especially did the great monster lie in wait on summer's Sunday afternoons. Then the sun would shine on its vast, placid bosom, and the breeze play gently, tempting the swimmer toward its borders, and the light pleasure craft toward its depths. And then, in mid-afternoon, a sudden disastrous change, a quick gale from the north, with a wide whipping up of whitecaps, and the morrow's newspapers told of bathers drowned in the undertow, of frail canoes dashed to pieces against piers and breakwaters, and of gay, beflagged steam launches swamped by the newly risen sea miles from shore. The toll of fickle, superheated August. But in the late autumn the immense, savage creature was more frankly itself. Rude, blustery, tyrannical, no more a smiling, cruel hypocrite. It warned you, often and openly, if warning you would take. It was on the last Sunday afternoon in October that Cope and Amy Leffingwell were strolling along its edge. They had met casually in front of the chapel after a lecture or a service by an eminent ethical teacher from abroad, a bird of passage who must pipe on this Sunday afternoon if he were to pipe at all. Cope, who had lain abed late, made this address a substitute for the forenoon service he had missed. And Amy Leffingwell had gone out somewhat for the sake, perhaps, of walking by the house where Cope lived. They passed the Science Building with its tower crowned by an ornamental open-work iron pyramid for wireless, and the segregated group of theological dormitories through whose windows earnest ringing young voices were sometimes heard at the practice of sermon delivery, and the men's club where the billiard tables were doubtless decorously covered with their customary Sunday sheets of black oilcloth, and took intuitively the path which led along the edge of the bluff. Beyond them, further bluffs and a few low headlands, here a lighthouse, there a water tower, elsewhere, and not so far, the balconied roof of the life-saving station, where the boats, light and heavy, were manned by muscular students, their vigilance and activity, interspersed with long periods of leisure or of absence, helped them to pay their way. Out toward the horizon, a passenger steamer en route to some port farther north or a long ore freighter, singularly uneventful, between bow and far distant afterhouse, on its way down from the iron ranges of Superior. The path was narrow, but Cope, unexpectedly to himself, had no complaint to make. Really, the girl did better here, somehow, than lots of other girls would have done on a wide sidewalk. Most of them walked too close to you, or too far from you, altering the interval suddenly and arbitrarily, and tending to bump against you when you didn't expect it and didn't want it. They were uncertain at crossings. If it was necessary for them to take your arm, as it sometimes became in the evening, on a crowded street, why, they were too gingerly or else pressed too close, and if it happened to rain, you sometimes had to take a cab, trafficking with a driver whose tariff and whose disposition you did not know. In fact, a string of minor embarrassments and expenses. But the way, this afternoon, was clear and easy, and there were no annoyances save from other walkers along the same path. The sun shone brightly at intervals. A fresh breeze swept the wide expanse, streaked with purple and green, and turned an occasional broken wave crest toward the western light. Some large cumuli were abroad, white or less white, or even darkling. The first windy sky of autumn. Cope and Amy passed the life-saving station, where a few people sat about idly and where one or two visitors pressed noses against glass panes to view the boats within, and they reached presently a sort of little public park which lay along the water. Here a small pier ran out past the shallows, and in front of a shack close by it a man sat resignedly near a group of beached and upturned rowboats. One or two others were still in the water, as was a small sloop. The fellow sat there without expectations. The season was about over. The day was none too promising for such as knew. His attitude expressed, in fact, the accumulated disappointment and resignation of many months. Perhaps he was a newcomer from the interior, some region of ponds and rivers, and had kept through an uneventful summer the notion that so big a spread of water would surely be put to use. The sail of the sloop, half lowered, flapped in the breeze, and little else stirred. Our young people overlooked both man and boat. "It's the same lake," said Amy Leffingwell, rather dreamily, after a common silence of several minutes. "The same," returned Cope promptly. "It's just what it was a year ago, a century ago, and a millennium ago, I suppose, if there was anyone here to notice." She turned on him a rueful, half-protesting smile. "I wasn't thinking of a century ago. I was thinking of a month ago." "A month ago?" "Yes, when we were walking along the dunes." "Oh, I see. Why, yes, it is the same old lake, though it seems hard to realize it. Foreground makes so much difference, and so does, well, population. I mean the human element, or the absence of it." Amy pondered. "The one drawback there was that we couldn't go out on the water." "Go out? I should say not. No pier for miles, and the water so shallow that hardly more than a canoe could land." "Still, those fishermen out there manage it." "But plain summerites, especially if not dressed for it, would have an unpleasant time imitating them." Amy cast her eye about. Here was a shore, a pier, a boat, a man to let it. "Would you like to go out?" asked the man himself perfunctorily, as from the depths of a settled despair. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward the sloop. The two young people looked at each other. Neither looked at the sky. "Well, I don't know," replied Cope slowly. The sloop was on a pretty small scale. Still, it was more to manage than a catboat. "You have the theory, you know," said Amy demurely. "And some practice." Cope looked at her in doubt. "Can you swim?" he asked. "Yes," she returned. "I have some practice, if not much theory." "Could you handle a jib?" "Under direction." "Well, then, if you really wish." The misanthrope, with a twisted smile, helped them get away. The mainsail took a steady set, but the jib, from the first, possessed an active life of its own. "Not that rope!" cried Cope. "The other!" "Very well," returned Amy, scrambling across the cockpit; and so it went. In 6 or 8 minutes their small catastrophe overtook them. There came a sudden flaw from out one of the racing gray cumuli, and a faint cry or two from the distant shore. Theory had not put itself into practice as quickly as the emergency required. All the less so in that it had to work through a crew encumbered with a longish skirt and a close jacket. The sloop keeled over. Cope was instantly entangled with the mainsail and some miscellaneous cordage, and Amy, with the water soaking her closely fitting garments, found herself clutching the cockpit's edge. She saw Cope's predicament and let go her hold to set him free. He helped shake himself loose with a loud forced laugh and a toss of the head to get his long hair out of his eyes. "We'll leave the wreck," he sputtered, "and make for the shore." The shore, fortunately, was scarcely more than 100 yards away. Yet never had the great twin towers of the library seemed so distant, or the wireless cage on Science Hall so futile. They swam, easily, side by side, he supporting her in her cramped clothes at the start, and she, a bit concerned, somewhat supporting him toward the end. Meanwhile, there was some stir at the life-saving station, a quarter of a mile down the shore. The last 100 feet meant mere wading, though there was some variability among the sand ridges of the bottom, but the water, at its deepest, never reached their shoulders. Their small accident now began to take on the character of a ceremonial, an immersion incident to some religious rite or observance, and the little Sunday crowd collecting on the water's edge might have been members of some congregation sympathetically welcoming a pair of converts to the faith. "Let's hold our heads high and walk straight," said Cope, his arm in hers. "Heaven knows whom we are likely to meet. And throw your hat away. You'll look better without it. Lord knows where mine is," he added, as he ran a smoothing hand over his long locks. "Very well," she said, casting away her ruined, ridiculous headgear with her free arm. The other, in his, was giving more support to him, she felt, than he was giving to her. Just as they were about to reach dry land, amidst the congratulations and the amused smiles of the little group at the foot of the bluff, the belated crew of life-savers swept up in their smallest boat and insisted on capturing them. "Oh, Mr. Cope," said a familiar voice, "please let us save you. We haven't saved a soul for months." Cope recognized one of his own students and surrendered, though a kindly house-owner on the bluff had been quick to cry across the intervening yards of water his offer of hospitality. "All right," he said. "Take us back to your place, where we can dry and telephone." He hoped, too, that they might have to encounter fewer people at the other spot than this. Meanwhile, another boat belonging to the station had set out to aid the owner of the sloop in its recovery. It was soon righted and was brought in. There was no damage done, and there was no charge that Cope could not meet, as he learned next day to his great relief. The station gave him a dry outfit of clothes, assembled from here and there, and telephoned to Mrs. Phillips to bring fresh garments for Amy. Neither had time to get a chill. A pair of kindly servant maids, who were loitering on the shore with their young men, insisted on carrying the heroine of the afternoon into retirement, where they expeditiously undressed her, rubbed her, and wrapped her in a quilt snatched from a life-saving bed. Amy was cold indeed, and inclined to shiver. She understood now why Cope had not encouraged that bathing party at the dunes. In a few minutes, Medora Phillips tore up in her car, with Helga and a mountain of clothing and wraps. She was inclined to make the most of the occasion, and she did so. With Helga, she quickly superseded the pair of sympathetic and ready maids, whom she allowed to fade into the background with too scant recognition of their services. And when she had got Amy thoroughly warmed and rehabilitated, she turned her thought toward Cope. Here, certainly, was a young scholastic recluse who had an admirable faculty for getting into the public eye. If one section of Churchton society had talked about his performance at her dinner, all sections of it would now be discussing his new performance on the high seas. Suddenly she was struck with the notion that possibly his first lapse had not left him in condition to stand this second one. "How are you feeling?" she asked anxiously. "No chill? No shock?" "I'm all right," he declared. "One of the boys has just given me a drink of but it was a beverage the use of which was not generally approved in Churchton. Mrs. Phillips turned round suddenly. "Amy, did you have a drink, too, of if 'of' is what you call it?" "I did," said Amy firmly, "and I feel the better for it." "Well, get in, then, and I'll take you home." Peter grinned from the front seat of the car. Mrs. Phillips placed herself between the two victims on the back one. The life-savers, who had kept the discarded garments to dry, gave them all a few smiles and hand-wavings. The two young women and their two young men looked on with some deference. The general crowd gave a little mock cheer before turning its Sunday leisure to other forms of interest, and the small party whirled away. Amy leaned a tired, moist head, but a happy one, on Mrs. Phillips' shoulder. "He was so quick," she breathed, "and so brave and so strong." She professed to believe that he had saved her life. Cope, silent, as he looked straight ahead between Peter and Helga, was almost afraid that she had saved his. End of Chapter 16. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 17 of Bertram Cope's Year. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Bertram Cope's Year by Henry Blake Fuller. Chapter 17. Cope Among Cross-Currents. Next morning at breakfast, Amy Leffingwell kept, for the most part, a rapt and meditative eye on her plate. Hortense gave her now and then an impatient, half-angry glare, and had to be cut short in some stinging observations on Cope. But it was foolish, Medora Phillips felt obligated to concede. What in the world made you do it? But Amy continued to smile at the tablecloth. She seemed to be intimating that there was a special folly which transcended mere general folly and approximated wisdom. After breakfast she spoke a few words to Carolyn. She had had all night to think the matter over. She now saw it from a new angle and in a new light. "You should have seen how he shook himself free from that sail and all," she said, "and while we were swimming in, he held his hand under my chin, at least part of the time. And when we reached the sandbars, he put his arm through mine and helped me over every one." And in this state of mind, she went off to her class. Cope was received by his own class with a subdued hilarity. His young people felt that he had shown poor judgment in going out on the water at all, for the University, by tacit consent, left the lake pretty well alone. They thought that, once out, he had shown remarkably inept seamanship, and they thought that he had chosen a too near and too well-lighted stage for the exhibition of both. This forenoon the 18th-century novelists involved Smollett, and with every reference to the water looks of understanding traveled from student to student. That the class was of both sexes made the situation no better. Cope was in good enough physical condition. The unspeakable draught from the unspeakable flask had ensured that. But he felt what was in the air of the classroom, and was correspondingly ill at ease. He had had, for several days, an understanding with Basil Randolph that they were to go together to the next weekly reception of the president's wife. Randolph wished to push Cope's fortunes wherever he might, and to make him stand out from the general ranks of the young instructors. He had the entree to the Thursdays at the president's house, and he wanted Cope to meet personally and intimately, under the guidance he could provide, a few of the academic dignitaries, and some of the wealthier and more prominent townspeople. Notwithstanding Mrs. Phillips' confident impression, Cope's exploit at her own table had gained no wide currency. The people she had entertained were people who expected and commanded a succession of daily impressions from one quarter or another. With them, a few light words on Cope's achievement were sufficient. They walked straight on toward the sensation the next day was sure to bring. But of course the whole university knew about his second performance. Some of its members had witnessed it. And all of them had read about it next day in Churchton's 4-page index. The president's wife was a sprightly lady who believed in keeping up the social end of things. Her Thursdays offered coffee and chocolate at a handsomely appointed table, and a little dancing now and then for the livelier of the young professors and the daughters of the town's best-known families. Above all, she insisted on receiving, even on having a receiving line. She would summon, for example, the wife of one of the most eminent members of the faculty and the obliging spouse of some educationally minded banker or manufacturer, and she herself always stood, of course, at the head of her line. When Cope came along with Randolph, she intercepted the flow of material for her several assistants farther on, and carried congestion and impatience into the waiting quay behind by detaining him and having it out. She caught his hand with a good firm nervous grasp, and flashed on him a broad meaningful smile. "Which saved which?" she asked heartily. Mrs. Ryder, who was farther along in the line, but not too far, beamed delightedly, yet without the slightest trace of malice. An eminent visiting educator, 5 or 6 steps behind our hero, frowned in question, and had to have the situation explained by the lady in his company. Cope, a trifle embarrassed and half inclined to wish he had not come, did what he could to deprive the episode of both hero and heroine. It was about an even thing, he guessed, a matter of cooperation. "Isn't that delightful?" exclaimed the president's wife to the wife of the banker, before passing Cope on. "And so modern! Equality of the sexes, woman doing her share, etc. For this," she presently said to the impatient educator from outside, "are we co-educational?" And "Good teamwork," she contrived to call after Cope, who was now disappearing in the crowd. Cope lost himself from Randolph, and presently got away without seeing who was pouring coffee or who was the lightest on foot among the younger professors. The president's wife had asked him, besides, how the young lady had got through it, and had even inquired after her present condition. Well, Amy Leffingwell was enrolled among the university instructors, and doubtless the wife of the institution's head had been well within her rights, even duly mindful of the proprieties. But the index, that sheet, staid and proper enough on most occasions, had seemed on this one to couple their names quite unwarrantably. Couple. Cope repeated the word, and felt an injury. If he had known that Amy had carefully cut out and preserved the offending paragraph, his thought would have taken on a new and more disquieting tone. In the inquiry of the president's wife about the condition of his co-partner in adventure, he found a second source of dissatisfaction. He had not called up to ask after Amy, but Mrs. Phillips, with a great show of solicitude, had called up early on Monday morning to ask after him. He had then, in turn, made a counter-inquiry, of course, but he could take no credit for initiative. Neither had he yet called at the house, nor did he feel greatly prompted to do so. That must doubtless be done, but he might wait until the first fresh impact of the event should somewhat have lost its force. Mrs. Phillips' voice had kept, over the telephone, all its vibratory quality. Its tones expressed the most palpitating interest. It was already clear, and it became even clearer when he finally called at the house, that she was poetizing him into a hero, and that she regarded Amy herself as but a means, an instrument. At this, Cope felt a little more mortified than before. He knew that he had done poorly in the boat, and he was not sure that, in the first moment of the upset, he should have freed himself unaided, and he confessed that he had not been quite in condition to do very well on the way landward. However, all passed. Within a fortnight, or less, the incident would have dropped back into its proper perspective, and his students would have found some other matter for entertainment. In the circumstances he grasped at the first source of consolation that came. Randolph was now installed in his new apartment, and felt that, though not fully settled, he might risk asking Cope to dinner. "You are the first," Randolph had said. Cope could not escape the flattery. It was almost comfort. His prompt acceptance was most welcome to Randolph. Cope had dwelt for a moment on the actual presence of Aunt Harriet and on his need of her. Randolph had made no precise study of recent chronology, taking the reason given over the wire as a valid one and feeling glad that there was no hitch this time. Randolph gave Cope a rapid view of the apartment before they sat down to dinner. There were fewer pictures on the newly papered walls than there were to be, and fewer rugs on the freshly varnished floors. "My standing lamp will be in that corner," said Randolph in the living room, "when it comes." He drew attention to a second bedroom where a man could be put up on occasion. "You, for example, if you ever find yourself shut out late." He saw Sir Galahad's gauntlets on the dresser. He even gave Cope a glimpse of his kitchen, where a self-contained Oriental, slightly smiling but otherwise inexpressive, seemed to be dealing competently with the gas range. But Cope was impressed, most of all, by the dining-room table and its paraphernalia. At Mrs. Phillips' he had accepted the china, silver, and napery as a matter of course, an elaborate entity quite outside his own thoughts and calculations. It was all so immensely far beyond his reach and his needs. Randolph, however, had dealt as a bachelor with a problem which he himself as a bachelor must soon take up, on however different a scale and plane. For everything here was rich and handsome. He should not know how to select such things, still less how to pay for them. He felt dashed. He felt depressed. Once more the wonder of people's having things. He sipped his soup in the spirit of humility, and did not quite recover with the chops. Randolph made little talk. He was glad merely to have Cope there. He indulged no slightest reference to the accident. He assumed willingly enough that Cope had done well in a sudden emergency, but did not care to dwell on his judgment at the beginning. Still, a young man was properly enough experimental, venturesome. Cope had recovered himself by the time dessert was reached. He accomplished an adjustment to his environment, and Randolph was glad to feel his unaffected response to good food properly cooked and served. "He shan't gypsy all the time," Randolph said to himself. "I shall try to have him here at least twice a week." Once in a while the evening might be stormy, and then the gauntlets would be laid on the dresser, perhaps after an informal smoke in pajamas among the curios ranged round the small den. Cope set down his demi-tasse with a slight sigh. "Well," he said, I suppose that, before long, I shall have to buy a few sticks of furniture myself, and a trifle of crockery, and a percolator." Randolph looked across at him in surprise. "You are moving, then? You too?" Not to greatly better quarters, he almost hoped. "Yes, and we shall need a few small things by way of outfit. We." Randolph looked more intently. Housekeeping à deux? A roommate? Matrimony? Here was the intrusion of another piece on the board, a piece new and unexpected. Would it turn out to be an added interest for himself, or a plain source of disconcertment? Cope, having unconsciously set the ball rolling, gave it further impetus. He sketched his absent friend, and told of their plans for the winter and spring terms. "I shall try for a large easy chair," he concluded, "unless Arthur can be induced to bring one with him." Randolph, by this time, had led Cope into the den, established him between padded arms, and given him a cigar. He drew Cope's attention to the jades and sword guards, to the odd assortment of primitive musical instruments, which would doubtless, in time, find a place at the art museum in the city, and to his latest acquisition, a volume of Bembo's Le Prose. It had reached him but a week before from Venice. "In Venetia al segno del pozzo, 1557," said the title page, in fact. It was bound in vellum, pierced by bookworms, and was decorated in quaint 17th-century penmanship, with marginal annotations, and also, on the fly-leaves, with repeated honorifics due to a study of the forms of address by some young aspirant for favor. Randolph had rather depended on it to take Cope's interest, but now the little envoy from the lagoons seemed lesser in its luster. Cope, indeed, took the volume with docility, and looked at its classical title page and at its quaint biblical colophon. But, "Just who was Pietro Bembo?" he asked, and Randolph realized, with a slight shock, that young instructors teach only what they themselves lately have learned, and that, in many cases, they have not learned much. But in truth, neither paid much heed to the tabulated vocables of the Venetian cardinal, nor to any of the other rarities near by. Basil Randolph was wondering how he was to take Arthur Lemoyne, and was asking himself if his trouble in setting up a new menage was likely to go for nothing. And Bertram Cope, while he pursued the course of the bookworm through the parchment covers and the yellowed sheets within, was wondering in what definite way his host might aid the fortunes of Arthur Lemoyne, and thus make matters a little easier for them both. "Al il Monsignore Paron o se vend, mo al il mon, etc. Monsignore Paron, al il mo et R. de Monsignore, Signore Pio, Francesco Bembo, Vesco et Conti de Belluno." Thus ran the faded brown lines on the flyleaf, in their solicitous currying of favor. But these reiterated forms of address conveyed no meaning to Cope and offered no opening. Now, as once before, he let the matter wait. Randolph thought over Cope's statement of his plans, and his slight touch of pique did not pass away. Toward the end of the evening he spoke of the wreck and the rescue, after all. "Well," he said, "you are not so completely committed as I feared." "Committed?" "By your new household arrangements." "Well, I shall have back my chum." Randolph put forward the alternative. "I was afraid, for a moment, that you might be taking a wife." "A wife?" "Yes, such a rescue often leads straight to matrimony, in the story-books, anyhow." Cope laughed, but with a slight disrelish. "We're in actual life still, I'm glad to think. "What I said on one stretch of the shore goes on the other," he declared. "I don't feel any more inclination to wedded life than ever, nor any likelihood," here he spoke with effort, as if conscious of a possible danger on some remote horizon, "of entering it." "It would have been sudden, wouldn't it?" commented Randolph with a short laugh. "Well," he went on, "one who inclines to hospitality must work with the material at his disposal. I shall be glad, on some occasion or other," he proceeded with a slight trace of formality creeping into his tone, "to entertain your friend." "I shall be more than glad," replied Cope, "to have you meet." End of Chapter 17. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 18 of Bertram Cope's Year. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Bertram Cope's Year by Henry Blake Fuller. Chapter 18. Cope at the Call of Duty. Cope took his own time in calling upon the Ashburn Avenue Circle, but he finally made in person the inquiries for which those made by telephone were an inadequate substitute. Yet he waited so long that only a few hours before the time he had set he received a sweet but somewhat urgent little note from Amy Leffingwell, suggesting his early appearance. He felt obliged to employ the first moments of his call in explaining that he had been upon the point of coming anyway, and that he had set aside the present hour 2 or 3 days before for this particular purpose, an explanation, he acknowledged inwardly, which held no great advantage for him. "Why am I spinning such stuff?" he asked himself impatiently. Amy's note, of course, minimized her aid to him and magnified his aid to her. All this was in accord with established form, but it was in still stronger accord with her determination to idealize his share in the incident. His arm had grasped hers firmly, and she felt it yet. But when she went on to say, not for the first time nor for the second, how kind and sympathetic he had been in supporting her chin against those slapping waves when the shore had seemed so far away, he wondered whether he had really done so. For a moment or two, possibly, but surely not as part of a conscious, reasoned scheme to save. "She was doing all right enough," he muttered in frowning protest. Neither did he welcome Mrs. Phillips' tendency to make him a hero. She was as willing as the girl herself to believe that he had kept Amy's chin above water, not for a moment merely, but through most of the transit to shore. He sat there uneasily, pressing his thumbs between his palms and his closed fingers, and drawing up his feet crampingly within their shoes. Yet it somewhat eased his tension to find that Medora Phillips was disposed to put Amy into a subordinate place. Amy had been but a means to an end. Her prime merit consisted in having given him a chance to function. Any other girl would have done as well. A slight relief, but a welcome. Another mitigation: the house. The room was full of people. The other young women of the household were present. Even the young businessman who had understood the stove and the pump had looked in. No chance for an intense, segregated appreciation. There had been another week-end at the dunes, when this youth had nimbly ranged the forest and the beach to find wood for the great open fireplace, and he had come, now at the end of the season, to make due acknowledgments for privileges enjoyed. He, for his part, was willing enough to regard Amy as a heroine, but he considered her as a heroine linked with the wrong man and operative in the wrong place. He cared nothing in the world for Cope and disparaged him as before, when he did not ignore him altogether. If Amy had but been rescued by him, George F. Pearson, instead of by this Bertram Cope, and if she had been snatched from a disorderly set of breakers at the foot of those disheveled sandhills instead of from the prim, prosy, domestic edge of Churchton, well, wouldn't the affair have been better set and better carried off? In such case, it might have been picturesque and heroic, instead of slightly silly. Yes, the room was full. Even Joseph Foster had contrived to get himself brought down by Peter. Further practice for the day when he should make a still more ambitious flight and dine at Randolph's new table. He sat in a dark corner of the room and tried to get, as best he might, the essential hang of the situation. The soft, insidious insistence of Amy, the momentum and bravado of his sister-in-law, the veiled disparagement of Cope in which George F. Pearson, seated on a sofa between Carolyn and Hortense, indulged for their benefit or for his own relief. Above all, he listened for tones and undertones from Cope himself. He had never seen Cope before, if indeed it could be said that he really saw him now, and he had never heard his speaking voice, save at a remove of 2 floors. Cope had taken his hand vigorously, as that of the only man, among many women, from whom he had much to expect, and had given him a dozen words in a loud tone which seemed to correspond with his pressure. But Cope's voice, in his hearing, had lapsed from resonance to non-resonance, and from that to tonelessness, and from that to quietude. Was the fellow in process of making a long diminuendo, a possible matter of weeks or of months? As before, when confronted by what had once seemed a paragon of dash and vigor, he scarcely knew whether to be exasperated or appeased. Through this variety of spoken words and unspoken thoughts, Hortense sat silent and watchful. Presently the talk lapsed. With the best will in the world, a small knot of people cannot go on elaborately embroidering upon a trivial incident forever. There was a shifting of groups, a change in subjects, yet Hortense continued to glower and to meditate. What had the incident really amounted to? What did the man himself really amount to? She soon found herself at his side, behind the library table and its spreading lamp-shade. He was silently handling a paper-cutter, with his eyes cast down. "See me," she said, in a tense, vibratory tone. "Speak to me." And she glowered upon him. "I am no kitten like Amy. I am no tame tabby like Carolyn, sending out written invitations. Throw a few words my way." Cope dropped the paper-cutter. Her address was like a dash of brine in the face, and he welcomed it. "Tell me, did you look absurd then?" She dashed ahead. A return to fresh water, after all. "Why," he rejoined reluctantly, "no man dressed in all his clothes looks any the better for being soaked through." And Amy, she must have looked absolutely ridiculous, that wide, flapping hat and all. I had been telling her for weeks that it was out of style. "She threw it away," said Cope shortly. "And I suppose her hair looked as well as a woman's ever does when she's in the water." "Well," she observed, "it's one thing to be ridiculous, and another to go on being ridiculous. I hope you don't mean to do that." The pronoun "you" has its equivalent aspects. Her expression, while marked enough, threw no clear light. Cope took the entire onus on himself. "Of course no man would choose to be ridiculous, still less to stay so. Do, please, let me keep on dry land. I'm beginning to feel waterlogged." He shifted his ground. "Why do you try to make it seem that I don't care to talk with you?" "Because you don't. Haven't I noticed it?" "I haven't. It seems to me that I—" "Of course you haven't. Does that make it any better? I'm sure the last thing in the world I should want to do would be to— I know, would be to show partiality, to fail in treating all alike. Even that small program isn't much, nor likely to please any girl. But you have failed to carry it out, small as it is. Here in this house, there on the dunes, what have I been, and where? Put into any obscure corner, lost in the woods, left off somewhere on the edge of things. Cope stared and tried to stem her protests. She was of the blood, her aunt's own niece. But whereas Medora Phillips sometimes scrapped, as he called it, merely to promote social diversion and to keep the conversational ball rolling, this young person, a more vigorous organism, and with decided, even exaggerated ideas as to her dues, well, the room was still full, and he was glad enough of it. "I don't know whether I like you or not," she went on, in a low, rapid tone, "and I don't suppose you very much like me, but I won't go on being ignored." "Ignored? Why," stammered Cope, "my sense of obligation to this house—" She shrugged scornfully. His sense of obligation had been made none too apparent. Certainly it had not been brought into line with her deserts and demands. Cope took up the paper cutter again and looked out across the room. Amy Leffingwell, questioningly, was looking across at him. He could change feet if that made the general discomfort of his position any less. He did so. Amy was standing near the piano and held a sheet or two of new music in her hands, and Medora Phillips, with a word of general explication and direction, made the girl's intention clear. Amy had a new song for baritone, with a violin obbligato and the usual piano accompaniment, and Cope was to sing it. 'Twas an extremely simple thing, quite within his compass, and Carolyn, who could read easy music at sight— "It's awfully easy," declared Amy— would play the piano part, and Amy herself would perform the obbligato, with no statement as to whether it was simple or not. Carolyn approached the task and the piano in the passive spirit of accommodation. Cope came forward with reluctance. This was not an evening when he felt like singing. Besides, he preferred to choose his own songs. Also, he would have preferred to warm up on something familiar. Amy took her instrument from its case with a suppressed sense of ecstasy, and it is the ecstatic who generally sets the pace. The thing went none too well. Amy was the only one who had seen the music before, and she was the only one who particularly wanted to make music now. However, the immediate need was not that the song should go well, but that it should go. That it should go on, that it should go on and on, repetitiously, until it should come, or even not come, to go better. She slid her bow across the strings with tasteful passion. She enjoyed still more than her own tones the tones of Cope's voice, tones which, whether in happy unison with hers or not, were, after all, seldom misplaced, whatever they may have lacked in heartiness and confidence. It was a short piece, and on the third time it went rather well. "How perfectly lovely!" exclaimed Mrs. Phillips at the right moment. Cope smiled deprecatingly. "It might be made to go very nicely," he said. "It has gone very nicely," insisted Amy. "It did this last time." She waved her bow with some vivacity. She had heaved the whole of her young self into the work. She had been buoyed up by Cope's tones, which, with repetition, had gathered assurance if not expressiveness, and she based her estimate of the general effect on the impression which her own inner nature had experienced. And her impression was heightened when Pearson, forging forward and ignoring both Cope and Carolyn, thanked her richly and emphatically for her part, a part which, to him, seemed the whole. Hortense, who had kept her place behind a large lamp-shade, twisted her interlocked fingers and said no word. Foster, who had disposed himself on an inconspicuous couch, kept his own counsel. After all, omne ignotum, Cope's singing had sounded better from upstairs. At close range, a ringing assertiveness had somehow failed. Cope had come with no desire to extend his stay beyond the limits of an evening call. He declined to sing on his own account, and soon rose as if to make his general adieu. "You won't give us one of your own songs, then?" asked Medora Phillips in a disappointed tone. "And at my dinner?" No, she could not quite say that, at her dinner, Cope, whatever he had failed to do, had contributed no measure of entertainment for her guests. "Give us a recitation, then," persisted Medora, "or tell us a story, or make up." Here she indulged herself in an airily imperious flight. "A story of your own on the spot." A trifling request, truly, but... "Heavens!" said Cope. "I am not an author. Still less an improvisatore." "I am sure you could be," returned Medora fondly. "Just try." Cope sat down again and began to run his eye uncomfortably about the room, as if dredging the air for an idea. Behind one corner of a mirror was a large bunch of drying leaves. They had been brought in from the sand dunes as a decorative souvenir of the autumn, and had kept their place through mere inertia. An oak bough, once crimson and russet, a convoluted length of bittersweet, to which a few split berries still clung, and a branch of sassafras, with its intriguing variety of leaves, a branch selected, in fact, because it gave, within narrow compass, the plant's entire scope and repertoire as to foliage. Cope caught at the sassafras as a falling balloonist catches at his parachute. "Well," he said, still reluctant and fumbling, "perhaps I can devise a legend, the legend, let us say, of the sassafras bush." "Good!" cried Medora heartily. Pearson, whispering to Amy Leffingwell, gave little heed to Cope and his strained endeavor to please Mrs. Phillips. Foster, quite passive, listened with curiosity for what might come. "Or perhaps you would prefer folklore," Cope went on. "Why the sassafras has 3 kinds of leaves, or something like that." "Better yet!" exclaimed Medora. "Listen, everybody. Why the sassafras has 3 kinds of leaves." Pearson stopped his buzzings, and Cope began. "The wood nymphs," he said slowly, "were a nice enough lot of girls, but they labored under one great disadvantage. They had no thumbs." Hortense pricked up her ears. Did he mean to be personal? If so, he should find that one of the nymphs had a whole hand as surely as he himself had a cheek. Cope paused. "Of course you've got to postulate something," he submitted apologetically. "Of course," Medora agreed. "So, when they bought their gloves, or mittens, or whatever their hand gear might be called, they usually patronized the hickory, or the beech, or some other tree with leaves that were..." "Ovate!" cried Medora delightedly. "Ovate, yes, or whatever just the right word may be. But a good many of them traded at the sign of the sassafras, where they found leaves that were similar, but rather more delicate." "I believe he's going to do it," thought Foster. Yet the nymphs knew that they lacked thumbs and kept on wanting them. So, during the long, dull winter, they put their minds to it, and finally thumbs came. "Willpower," said Medora. And early in April they went to the sassafras and said, "We have thumbs! We have thumbs! So we need a different sort of mitten." The sassafras was only half awake. "Thumbs?" he repeated. "How many?" "2!" cried the nymphs. "2!" A passing breeze roused the sassafras. He became at least 3/4 awake. "I doubt it," muttered Hortense. "That's interesting," he said. "I aim to supply all new needs. Come back in a month or so, and meanwhile I'll see what I can do for you." In May the nymphs returned with their thumbs and asked, "How about our new mittens?" The story was really under way now, and Cope went on with more confidence and with greater animation. "Look and see," said the sassafras. They looked and saw. Among its simple, ordinary leaves were several with 2 lobes, one on each side. "Will these do?" "Do?" said the nymphs. "We said we had 2 thumbs, but we meant one on each hand, stupid. Do? We should say not." The sassafras was mortified. "Well," he said, "that's all I can manage this season. I'm sorry not to have understood you young ladies and your needs. Come back again next spring." It was a long time to wait, but they waited. Next May, Amy, now unworried by George Pearson, began to get the thread of the thing. Foster was sure the thread would run through. Hortense was still alert for ulterior meanings. Poor Cope, however, had no ambition to spin a double thread. A single one was all he was equal to. Next May, the nymphs, after nursing their thumbs for a year, Hortense frowned, came back again, and there, among the plain leaves and the double-lobed leaves, were several fresh, bright, smooth ones, with a single lobe well to one side, the very thing for mittens. And "Yes, he has done it," Foster acknowledged. "And that," ended Cope rather stridently, as he rose to go on the flood of a sudden yet unexpected success, "is why the sassafras—" "Why, the sassafras has 3 kinds of leaves!" cried Medora in triumph. Mittens for midsummer made no difficulty. Cope gave Carolyn careful thanks for her support at the piano, and did not see that she felt he too could be a poet if he only would. He went out of his way to shake hands with Hortense, and did not realize how nearly a new quarrel had opened. He stepped over to do the like with Amy, but she went out with him into the hall, the only one of the party who did, and even accompanied him to the front door. "Thank you so much," she said, looking up into his face smilingly and holding his hand with a long, clinging touch. "It went beautifully, and there are others that will go even better." "Others?" He thought for an instant that she was thanking him for his legend, and was even threatening to regard him as a flowing fount of invention, but he soon realized that her mind was fixed exclusively on their duet, if such it was to be called. "The deuce!" he thought. "Enough is enough." Despite his success with the sassafras, he went home discomforted and even flustered. That hand was too much like the hand of possession. The girl was stealing over him like a light, intangible vapor. He struck ahead with a quicker gait, as if trying to outwalk a creeping fog. One consolation, however, Hortense had come like a puff of wind. Even a second squall from the same quarter would not be altogether amiss. And had there not been one further fleeting source of reassurance? Had he not, on leaving, caught through the open door of the drawing-room an elevation of Medora Phillips' eyebrows, which seemed to say fondly, indulgently, yet a bit ironically, "Oh, you foolish girl"? Yet if a girl is foolish, and is going to persist in her folly, a lightly lifted pair of eyebrows will not always stay her course. Her gathering momentum is hardly to be checked by such slender means. End of Chapter 18. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista.